Let's get into it. Many of you know that a very scathing, a very volatile, a very vociferous BBC documentary has just been released on the late T.B. Joshua. Now, let's give you context. T.B. Joshua was a man that called himself a charismatic preacher and a healer. Now, it's very important for us to look at T.B. Joshua's life in context. You must understand that T.B. Joshua was an uneducated man that came from very humble beginnings. And I often say about these cult leaders, because there's one thread, one common thread that runs through most of them. And that is they come from very humble backgrounds, many times uneducated people that couldn't even read in some cases. T.B. Joshua famously didn't know really how to speak English. He couldn't really express himself fully. He spoke in parables, sort of, and any time he stood in front of people, by the time he had received this worldwide notoriety, his personality got to a place where he didn't really have to say much. He was being viewed as this so-called prophet of God, when really, when you look at him very closely, when you take a closer look at who T.B. Joshua was under a magnifying glass, you will discover very quickly that he lived a very disturbing life that didn't mirror, didn't reflect anything close to what he presented on television. But you must start from there. You must start from the fact that most of these cult leaders, they start out with a genuine desire, a genuine hunger for God. They start out genuinely wanting to serve God, preach the gospel. The Word of God says, go ye into all the world, preach the gospel. Start here, go into the surrounding areas, and ultimately to the uttermost parts of the world. This is what they begin doing. But then along the way, they lose their way because they become intoxicated with power and that environment where nobody questions them. It's a very intoxicating environment. And you can only know what I'm talking about if you've been in that environment. Anytime you are part of a church or a group that looks at the pastor or the bishop as not only a servant of God, but close to God. Whenever your bishop or your pastor or your papa presents himself as an oracle of God that cannot be questioned, that cannot be challenged, that cannot be called out if and when there's wrongdoing, when you have that type of personality, it's called the cult of personality. It's a thing, and it happens all over the world. It doesn't happen just in America, it happens here. Many of you remember the story of David Koresh. All the same story. David Koresh was a young man that thought that he wanted to serve God, but along the way, he lost his way and he began to build a militia, a small group of people that believed his type of gospel, that ultimately began to preach that he was Christ, that he was deity, that he was God. And here's what you must understand about cults, is that, and I know many of you will know this when I say it, a cult leader that has convinced his following that he is God or close to God will say anything and everything, and that congregation or that audience will believe everything he says without question. For example, T.B. Joshua told his congregation, his followers, that he spent 15 months in his mother's womb. 15 months. Well, that's a bald-faced lie. That didn't happen. That's a lie. It's just ridiculous. But because of the cult of personality, because TB Joshua had gained such a level of notoriety from amongst his followers, amongst the people that he had brainwashed and trained over time into thinking that he was Christ or close to Christ, he stood up in front of his congregation and said, I spent 15 months in my mother's womb. Nobody in his church questioned that. Everybody just cowered in fear. Oh, God, you spent 15 months in your mother's womb. You must be the servant of God. God's radiance and countenance must shine on you. You must be some kind of special something for you to spend 15 months in your mother's womb. You must be special. God must have set you aside for a specific task and purpose. God must have set you aside as a special individual. You're not from amongst us mere mortals. Oh no, you spent 15 months in your mother's womb. You must be special. Well, that's a bunch of bull roar. Iyo aisabuka tilero ati 15 months in your mother's womb. Where have you heard of such nonsense? But because you are saying that to a group of people that over time you have trained into believing everything you say, they believe it. They believe it. And here it is. TB Joshua is one of those men that went to his grave without having paid for the crimes that he committed against the women in that Gothic church. Anytime you have a group of women that come together, a conglomeration of women, a congregation of women, and they begin to say, thus and so, this happened to me, that happened to me, I was raped, I was sodomized, I was forced to have an abortion. The list goes on and on and on. Anytime you have a group of women that independently begin to speak like that, my brothers and sisters, there's a problem there. And what I find disturbing about this TB Joshua saga is that many of you have brought it down to colonialism simply because it's a BBC documentary. You've turned it into some type of racial witch hunt. Some of you are saying, no, if David Livingstone, if TB Joshua truly committed those crimes, then David Livingstone should come back and apologize for lying that the Victoria Falls was Victoria Falls. Two different topics, two different issues. Don't spin this and make it a racial issue. When you do that, you're diverting from the main issue. And that is very, very indicative of cults. Anytime, it's called gaslighting. That's the phrase. It's gaslighting. You know people that are in a relationship and you start talking about an issue that is affecting their home as a couple. This happens with narcissistic people. You're talking about issue A, but because the narcissist wants to divert attention from issue A, they start talking about B. No, let's talk about B. No, let's deal with A. So in this case, whenever you're talking about these allegations, and they are gross allegations, very believable because this is how cult leaders are. It's a common thread. This is not the first time that we've seen such a... Eddie Long, Bishop Eddie Long went through the same thing. He did the same thing. John General, we've got our own TB Joshua right here in Lusaka, Zambia. John General of Matero, a demon-induced, a demon-possessed man, that calls himself a man of God when he's anything but a man of God. He's the very personification of evil. He's the very personification of decadence. This John General, who touts himself as a servant of the people of Matero, upon close examination, you discover very quickly that he's a sodomite. He's a rapist. He's a man that is consumed with himself. So it is not surprising. We're not surprised when we hear stories like T.B. Joshua. It's only you that are unenlightened, that you read this T.B. Joshua story and you're shocked and it throws you aback and you think, oh Lord, how could this happen? Guys, these are simply men. They're flawed, fickle, fallible human beings. That's all they are. And you are wrong and you are misled and misguided when you look at them as deity. The problem is many of you deify your bishops. You deify your papas. What does it mean to deify? To deify means to look at your papa like he's God. He's not God. He's a servant. Okay? He's a vessel. He's to teach you the word of God. If he doesn't teach you the balanced, infallible, unalterable word of God, then you're going to turn out wrong. You as the members of his congregation. But if he manipulates you, and this is what most of these guys do, if your papa, your bishop manipulates you into thinking that every word that comes out of his mouth is gospel, every word that comes out of his mouth is God inspired. If a bishop says to you, God has spoken to me to have sex with you, and when you have sex with me, it's going to please God. That's nonsense. But that's happening. It happens. It happens. It happens in John General's church. It used to happen in Andrew Ejimadu's church. The man that you call Seer 1, the young man that Zambians used to look to and say, oh, Andrew tells the truth. Seer 1, Seer 0 tells the truth. That same young man, when he had a church here, the allegations of rape, child molestation were as long as my arm. It's the same thing. They're all the same. There's nothing different. The word of God says in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. And one of the telltale signs of a cult church is if they don't exegete, if they don't teach the balanced word of God. If all there is just fire, 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 fire. If all you hear and all you experience when you go to church is all they talk about is money, healing, and fire, if that's all they talk about, you're in trouble. You run from that church like you would run from a boa constrictor. You run from that church like you would run from a Gabon viper. The truth is not in them. They're lying through their teeth. They're trying to hoodwink you. They're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. What you need to do is find a church somewhere that preaches the uncompromised word of God. What you need to do is find a church somewhere that preaches heaven holy, hell hot, and God pure. That's what you need. Some of you are stuck in these churches. All they do is say, fire, fire, fire. That's why that's why some of you women, you are consumed by these papas because they hoodwink you. You think that Gothic church that T.B. Joshua built there in South Africa, in Nigeria, you think that was normal? Women upon women have come forward now saying we were forced to abort our children. It was a sex slave dungeon. You think that was normal? And for those of you that sit there and say, but when the man is dead, he can't defend himself. We've got T.B. Joshua's right now. We've got TB Joshua's running around right now. John General is a TB Joshua. Andrew Ajimadu is a TB Joshua. Iginlao is a TB Joshua. The guy over there in Uganda is a TB Joshua. You got TB Joshua still running around here. TB Joshua's been dead for a couple of years, for a few years, but we still have the likes of him running around among us. What's the answer? Join a Bible-based church that preaches the balanced Word of God. Get away from these fly-by-nights, these lunatics. All they do is shout, fire! The moment anyone says fire, you run from that church. It's a mess. It's a mess. Don't you take your children there. Don't you take your daughters there. Do not introduce your girl children to these papas. Don't introduce your wives to these papas. All they have on their minds is to get into their pants. That's all they've got on their minds. And I'm telling you now, watch it. Be careful. Be vigilant. Word of God says, watch and pray. Watch and pray. Watch and pray. All right. Thought I'd share that with you guys. Have a good evening. Love you.